Alrighty, well, interesting thing about Pangea, I guess. A lot of people have heard of Pangea, and this is the concept that the tectonic plates, that the crust of the Earth is sort of like a very thin, sort of like the shell on a raw egg, where there's goo inside, and the hard shell on the outside is cracked up, and it moves around. And so that's what the crust of the Earth is sort of like. And it moves over convection currents and things like that in the asthenosphere, layers inside the Earth. Anyways, so the Pangea as a supercontinent was not the only one. In fact, it might not have been the most important one. The continents have moved around, and they've been building and building and getting bigger because it's an upwelling of lighter materials as the Earth is differentiating from heavy materials in the center of the Earth, and lighter things float towards the outer surface and build up on the surface, and they don't subduct and recycle. And so as a result, the continents, which are less dense, light and fluffy, I suppose, and float, and they don't get recycled, and so the continents get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. Anyways, way back when, about 3 billion years ago, we have a supercontinent, and these are really, like when you talk about old things, really super old, there's a lot of possible error involved here. However, we refer to some of the early continental material as about 3 billion years ago. It wasn't nearly as big as the continents today, but and they collected the continental masses, I suppose, collected in a sort of supercontinent called much smaller than the continents today. Anyways, and then around 2.5 billion years ago, Arctica, and then a little later, 2 billion years ago, Atlantica, and so this is Arctica, and coming together with making a new continent called Atlantica. And eventually, around 200 million years later, Nina, and we're just referring to these things. Of course, there were people around there to name things, so we're just referring to them as Nina. And eventually, these subcontinents, or I guess continental materials, came together to form Columbia around 1.8 to 1.5 billion years ago. And so it's a very, very, very long time ago. Anyways, and so Atlantica, and Nina came together to form what we refer to as Columbia. And then that broke up, and then it reformed around 1.3 billion years ago, formed Rodinia. Now, Rodinia is the supercontinent prior to Pangea. It's when most of the continents were together as one landmass, which we called Rodinia. Now, a lot of times you'll see things like this where they're showing a part of Rodinia, at least, which looks awfully familiar to us. Seems to have Hudson's Bay in there, and Alaska, like that. That's just to give you some concept of where the continents are located, or where the remnants of today's, I suppose the ancestral bits of today's continents were located. Anyways, they weren't really that shape at that time. So they were all together. Not every continental landmass on Earth was together as one landmass. However, a lot of them were. And we call that supercontinent Rodinia. Now, the important part of Rodinia is that when it breaks up around 800 million years ago, it was near the equator, and when it broke up, all that interior surface started to have, shallow marine ocean basins, and so spreading centers created shallow marine areas, which were warm, shallow, marine, and single-celled life in the oceans, which was all the life there was, had a lot of new niches, a lot of new things to evolve into. And so we started to get multicellular life, and this was the beginning of multicellular life when Rodinia breaks up. It's because of all the new ecological niches in which life could survive. And so, a lot of evolution happened right there. That might be the most important supercontinent the Earth has ever seen, just because it gave rise to multicellular life when it broke up. Then, around 270 million years ago-ish, the continents started to come back together again, started to collide again, and form Pangea. Now, Pangea is the one that most people seem to think about, or have heard of, And when Pangea forms, you can imagine that the center of it would be a long ways from the coast and be pretty dry. And so things that were alive on the prior continents, now there's a lot of dry land. And so this sort of encouraged evolution for things like amphibians, which were pretty much the most advanced life form around at that time, to develop the amniotic egg, to develop an egg which could survive a dry environment until birth. And so that gave rise to reptiles and the dinosaur age, which at least began on Pangea. Anyways, it's because there was a great big dry environment in the middle, and life evolved to survive that dry environment. Yeah. Anyways, and of course, when that breaks up, then we get the Atlantic Ocean as we know it today. But yeah, well, sort of as we know it today. It took a long time to develop. Okay, that's just a little bit about Pangea and its precursors, Rodinia, which is probably more important than Pangea, or certainly at least as important. And some of the earlier ones, and of course the earlier ones, Rodinia is pretty well established in terms of scientific proof. Some of the earlier ones, obviously they were around, but whether they're exactly as shown here, well, that's a little bit up for grabs. Anyways, okay, that's it. Bye for now.